can't believe this about my grandmother!
And then there are discoveries that create questions you never imagined asking. Questions about your family. Questions about your identity. Questions about whether the people you loved most carried secrets they intended to take to their graves. For me, that moment began in the attic of an old house in Ohio, United States. What I found there wasn't gold, money, or some forgotten family treasure. It was a stack of letters. And by the time I finished reading them, everything I thought I knew about my family had changed forever. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you, and don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. My grandmother, who we'll call Margaret Carter, passed away in the spring of 2021 at the age of 92. She had spent most of her life in a small town outside Columbus, Ohio. To everyone who knew her, she represented stability. She was the woman who never forgot a birthday, never missed a church service, and somehow knew every family story by heart. After her funeral, my mother and I began the difficult process of sorting through her belongings. Room after room contained decades of memories, family photographs, old furniture, handwritten recipes, newspaper clippings, boxes filled with documents no one had touched in years. The last place we tackled was the attic. The attic had always fascinated me as a child. It felt like a place frozen in time. Dust floated through the sunlight that entered from a small window. Old trunks lined the walls, stacks of boxes sat untouched in corners. While moving a heavy wooden chest, I noticed something hidden behind it. A small metal lockbox. The box wasn't locked. Inside were dozens of letters bundled together with a faded blue ribbon. Every envelope was addressed to my grandmother. Most of them were dated between 1948 and 1952. At first, I assumed they were ordinary letters from friends or relatives. Then I noticed something unusual. Every envelope came from the same person, a man named Daniel Reed. I had never heard that name before, not once. And in a family that loved telling stories, that struck me as strange. Curiosity got the better of me. I unfolded the first letter, then another, then another. Within minutes, I realized these letters weren't ordinary correspondence. They were love letters, passionate, heartfelt letters written by a young man deeply in love with my grandmother. The more I read, the more confused I became. According to every family story I had ever heard, my grandmother met my grandfather in 1953 and married him shortly afterward. Yet these letters described a serious relationship years earlier. The two discussed marriage. They discussed buying a home together. They discussed building a future. Then, halfway through the collection, the tone changed. The optimism vanished. The letters became anxious. Certain passages hinted at family disapproval. Others referred to difficult decisions. One letter stood out from all the others. It contained a sentence I still remember word for word. It read, "No matter what happens, I will always think about our son." Our son. I froze. I read the sentence again, then again. The implication was impossible to ignore. The letters suggested that before meeting my grandfather, my grandmother had a child no one in the family had ever mentioned. I spent hours reading every letter. By midnight, I had assembled a rough timeline. In 1949, Daniel and Margaret were in a committed relationship. In early 1950, Margaret became pregnant. Shortly afterward, pressure began coming from both families. The letters referenced shame, community expectations, and fears about the future. By late 1950, Daniel's letters became increasingly desperate. Then, suddenly, they stopped. The final letter ended with uncertainty. No explanation, no closure, just silence. For weeks, I couldn't stop thinking about what I had found. The existence of a hidden child would completely rewrite our family's history. I needed answers. I began researching public records throughout Ohio. At first, I found nothing. Then I expanded my search: birth records, county archives, historical newspapers, genealogy databases. Slowly, pieces of a forgotten story emerged. One newspaper clipping from 1950 mentioned that a young local woman had temporarily left town due to what was described as a family situation. The timing matched perfectly. Then came the breakthrough. Buried within county records was a birth registration from September 1950. The mother's information matched my grandmother. The father's section was blank. My hands shook as I stared at the document. The child was real. The letters had been telling the truth all along. The question was no longer whether the child existed. The question was what happened to him. Months passed. The search became an obsession. Every clue seemed to lead to another dead end. Then I discovered references to a private adoption agency operating in Ohio during the early 1950s. The dates aligned almost perfectly. The evidence suggested that shortly after birth, the child had been placed for adoption. The realization hit me harder than I expected. An entire life had existed just outside the boundaries of every family story I had ever heard. An uncle, a brother to my mother, a missing branch of the family tree, and nobody had ever spoken about him. The deeper I searched, the more I began to understand the historical context. America in the late 1940s and early 1950s was a very different place. Social expectations were strict. Young unmarried couples often faced enormous pressure. Many families believed secrecy was preferable to public embarrassment. Across the United States, thousands of children were quietly placed for adoption during that era. Many records remained sealed for decades. Many families never discussed what happened. Eventually, I located a possible lead, a man living in Pennsylvania whose age, adoption history, and available records matched everything I had uncovered. For days, I debated whether to contact him. What if I was wrong? What if reaching out caused unnecessary pain? What if he didn't want answers? Finally, I sent a message. Then I waited. A week passed. Nothing. 2 weeks passed. Still nothing. Then one evening, an email appeared in my inbox. The message was short, only a few sentences. But one line immediately caught my attention. It said, "I've spent my entire life wondering where I came from." The conversation that followed changed everything. Over the next several months, we exchanged photographs, documents, and family histories. The similarities became impossible to ignore: the shape of the jaw, the eyes, even certain expressions. It felt like looking at a relative I had somehow always known but never met. Then came the most emotional moment of all. I sent him copies of the letters. For the first time in his life, he was reading words written by his biological parents. Words intended for each other. Words written years before he was born. Words that explained the impossible choices they faced. As he read them, a picture emerged. Margaret and Daniel had wanted to keep their child. The letters made that clear. But economic hardship, family pressure, and social expectations created obstacles they couldn't overcome. The adoption was not the result of a lack of love. In many ways, it seemed to be the result of circumstances neither of them knew how to escape. One letter contained a sentence that stayed with me long after I finished reading it. Daniel wrote that he hoped their son would someday know he had always been loved. For more than 70 years, that message remained hidden inside an attic. For more than 70 years, the person it was meant for never saw it. Until now. Eventually, our extended family met the man who had spent decades searching for answers. The reunion was emotional. There were tears. There were awkward silences. There were stories exchanged across generations. And there was a shared realization that an entire chapter of family history had finally returned. Some relatives struggled with the discovery. Others embraced it immediately. But everyone agreed on one thing. The letters had revealed a truth that would otherwise have disappeared forever. Looking back, what amazes me most isn't the secret itself. It's how close it came to remaining hidden. If that lockbox had been thrown away, if those letters had been damaged by time, if nobody had bothered exploring the attic, the story might never have been uncovered. The missing pieces would have stayed missing, and an entire branch of a family would have remained disconnected. Sometimes history isn't hidden in museums or archives. Sometimes it's hidden in the homes we grew up in, inside forgotten boxes, inside faded envelopes, inside words written decades earlier by people who never imagined someone would one day read them. The attic in Ohio didn't contain treasure in the traditional sense, but what it contained was far more valuable. It contained the truth. And sometimes the truth changes everything you thought you knew about where you came from.